Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's Friday, which means that the weekend's just around the corner. You don't have to listen to bad news. Allah, I've got videos coming out on Saturday and Sunday, so if you haven't already, go check those out. I mean, they will come out on Saturday and Sunday. Wow, look at that. Anyway, before we get on to the main video of today, can I just again remind you, help me beat Ronaldo hosts and get to 200,000 subscribers. So subscribe to the channel, share this video with friends, and help the video go viral. So let's get onto the news of today. Well, the people that run this country, the ANC, they can't pay their payroll again. So the ANC has once again failed to pay staff salaries on time. Now, the actual salary bill is over 10 million rand a month, but they can't sustain that anymore. As you know, they already have numerous instances where they failed to pay ANC staffers. And I've got to say, if I was an ANC employee at this point in time, I probably wouldn't work there because the chances of actually getting paid are rather slim. Now, staff are getting the same message over and over again, and that is salaries will be staggered. Bear with us while direct debit orders are bouncing and repossessions loom. Now, those repossessions have been seen before denial, with numerous individuals in denial having reported before that when the state don't pay them, their properties get repossessed because the state didn't pay them and they've got bills to pay. But this isn't a once-off crisis. It's now the business model for the ANC. So what we are finding is that whilst the ANC continues with the whole power that it has, power in municipalities and the whole patronage network that it seems to push forward for cadres, their own workers go unpaid. I mean, imagine that was a private sector company. The ANC would probably burn the place down. But for the ANC, business as usual. Now, Panyago Lesufi has stood up at a Johannesburg regional conference and admits the obvious. He says that the ANC is on a sinking ship. He says that they've lost half their support in Joburg in over a decade. He says that voters don't feel they left the ANC, they feel that the ANC left them. That's because ultimately what the ANC did is to self-enrich whilst they impoverished the very nation they were meant to uplift. Now, ordinary people continue to complain about unemployment, corruption, and nepotism, whilst the party seems to care more about factional fights than actual jobs. So the Sufi tries to blame everybody from the DA to the government's national unity, but the message is clear. The movement, the ANC itself, is rotting from the inside. The ANC always wants to blame everyone else. It's apartheid, it's legacy this, it's colonialism, it's debt, it's whatever. But it's the ANC ultimately that has caused its own demand. So let's look at something even more insidious now than the ANC and the ANC's internal decay. As you all know, 17 South African men were lured to Russia with promises of bodyguard training. They signed contracts in Russian that they couldn't read, only to find themselves being sent to the front lines in Ukraine. Donetsk was literally a one-way ticket to the war zone. Now, you will recall that this was all part of Zuma. That's Dudu Zuma's role. She apparently was the one who coordinated the logistics, and she was the one who sent the men there. We will recall that the MK party said, well, actually had nothing to do with us. Except it has now turned out that apparently the MK party itself, Zuma's outfit, has been billed 20,000 rand for one of those soldiers' travel tickets. So yes, this invoice has gone to the MK party's parliamentary address, like they're actually showing it in parliament. They claim they had nothing to do with it, but unfortunately the paper trail doesn't lie. So unfortunately what we now see is that the Liberation Party and the Liberation Splinter Party are both as corrupt as hell. So we've got a ruling party that can't pay its own people, and a party set up by a former president of the Republic being invoiced for tickets sending individuals to war zones. Yeah, is there any wonder why they talk about these parties as being sinking ships? Because really they are sinking in terms of moral decay. Now, in terms of sinking ships, let's turn our attention through to the Firearms Amendment Bill. This is the proposed bill that hasn't actually become a bill yet. They're just starting to discuss it. This is the bill that apparently is being floated by NEDLAC, and there was a discussion yesterday around NEDLAC, around the proposals on this bill, and to be frank, the firearms community went there and told NEDLAC to footsack, because NEDLAC really doesn't seem to have a clue about anything to do with firearms in the Republic. So, what do we actually now know? Oh, Ian Cameron has found out that in the last 5 years, 3,400 SAP firearms have been lost or stolen, and only a fraction of them have actually been recovered. Now, these aren't civilian firearms, and we're being told constantly the reason that you should be disarmed is because, well, your civilian firearms are ultimately landing up in the hands of the criminals and is being used for criminal enterprises. Now, these guns, these 3,400 SAPS firearms, well, these are state guns. They were all issued to officers, and their flow has gone straight into the criminal market. Now, the police refuse to tell Parliament which stations are the worst offenders, and we can probably guess they're probably going to be like the Northwest and Limpopo and Mpumalanga. You can let me know what you think in the comment section below. But this idea that they won't actually identify who the offenders are is one of the problems in terms of being able to address the vulnerabilities. Because if you don't name and shame the corrupt and the incompetent, you can't address it. So this leads to the logical question, and that is, how can the government push for tighter gun control on law-abiding citizens, restrict civilian ownership, whilst thousands of police firearms vanish into the criminal underworld? Because you could disarm the entire public, and you could just leave firearms in the hand of the police, and they'd still go to the corrupt, and they'd still end up in the underworld and still be used for crimes. The only difference now is that the ordinary citizen would be disarmed and couldn't actually protect themselves. He said it doesn't take a genius to figure this out. So whilst you've got political actors sending people to fight in Ukraine underneath shady contracts, and you've got a ruling party that can't pay salaries, they want you now to not own a firearm to be able to protect your own home. But they can't protect your home themselves. And they can't secure their own firearms. Yeah, this is the ANC government all over. And then they describe themselves as a sinking ship. I pretty much have more interesting words that I would use to describe them. Now, moving then on from security, and let's move on and have a quick look at the economy, because unfortunately we're seeing the same thing. We're seeing in the economy forms of decay plus denial. Because as you'll know, one of the big issues that we have in the Republic is around chrome smelters. Now, the chrome smelters in the country are closing because the electricity prices have shot up by 900% since 2000. Now, power makes up around 30% of their production costs. This is in contrast to China, where they actually subsidize the power to smelters. Now, huge chunks of smelting capacity are now idle, with thousands of jobs gone, and ESCOM loses massive revenue because they can't sell electricity to the smelters that close. So what has been the cabinet's response? Well, they've had a half-baked, discounted tariff plan that's too weak to save most plants. So this is the government just trying to put some kind of pity tariff plan out there and said, oh, there you go. But you see, only the very best and most efficient smelters will survive this plan. These are individuals that basically automate everything and somehow have their own ability to generate their own power. Now, you see, when the government has to compete directly against China, China subsidizes its industries. But in South Africa, no subsidies, no free rides, just different power pricing structures to keep them globally competitive whilst they transition to renewables. So in other words, they say, well, you basically have to generate your own power if you want to be competitive. I mean, this is the ANC's logic. So the private sector is now trying to redesign ESCOM's business model so that they can become self-sufficient in order to stay alive. Sounds like a good plan, doesn't it? Now, you see the same story rolling out into pharmaceuticals. South Africa imports over 70% of its medicines by value. Almost all active pharmaceutical ingredients imported. State procurement spends billions on drugs, and yet there's almost no serious local manufacturing capacity. Now, that isn't because we don't have manufacturers. Don't forget they did create a manufacturer in Port Elizabeth and never actually made anything in Port Elizabeth. Now, we actually have the tools to fix all these problems in the guise of the National Industrial Participation Program. Big foreign companies that win contracts are supposed to invest locally, transfer technology and build capacity. But in practice, there's nothing of the sort, specifically even from Chinese companies. They deliver nothing and they face zero consequences. Now, other countries such as Brazil and Turkey, they use similar tools and they actually enforce them, and they have seen economic growth. And it's amazing that whilst we're trying to get China to bring so many things here, China doesn't invest. Now, many of these companies are meant to build local factories, transfer skills, and lock in long-term production into South Africa. South Africa actually has this policy on paper, but it just gathers dust. We do nothing with it. I mean, the story of the government's life, right? So here's the pattern. We've got ESCOM killing off energy-intensive businesses like smelters. We need smelters, otherwise we're not going to have much of a mining industry. Whilst the government promotes localization with actual programs and tools in place, such as the National Industrial Participation Program, where they're supposed to invest locally, in practice, well, there's nothing of the sort. So what we're actually seeing here is deindustrialization in South Africa, but it's not by accident. Our competitors are actively looking to ensure that South Africa deindustrializes so that it can continue to sell to South Africa, and the South African government has zero ability to stop it, not because they don't have the tools. They have the tools, but they're just incompetent. Imagine what a competent government in this country could do. Now, whilst deindustrialization is occurring on massive scales in South Africa, with the government almost having a hand in the deindustrialization of the country, the world is busy responding, and it's not responding in a positive way. And by the world, I basically mean Donald Trump, right? So this is following the G20 announcement, the new G20, that now excludes South Africa and has welcomed in Poland. So South Africa hasn't been invited to key meetings, and on paper the G20 is consensus-based, but in reality, Washington is leaving out Cyril Ramaphosa and South Africa from all the meetings. They're already on the sidelines. Now, as you know, the US government has actually accused South Africa of turning the G20 into a forum for aid dependency. And that's true because that's what Cyril did during the last G20 in Johannesburg. They've also accused South Africa of being obsessed over climate, diversity, and Palestine. All true, because these were all priorities put forward by South Africa. And they've accused South Africa of ignoring American concerns and even doxing US diplomats. So yes, the US government thinks that the ANC are a bunch of tools, and by extension also the DA now, because the DA is firmly ANC light. Now they are attacking, that's the American government, are attacking BEE and race-based policies, suggesting that these themselves, these policies are proof that the ANC is racist, corrupt, and destroying the economy. And when you look at it, these policies have directly been linked to the destruction of the economy and the decline in the economy. So to be honest, it's actually true that these policies have directly contributed to the destruction in the economy. Now, at the same time, the White House press secretary says that refugees admissions are effectively closed, as globally they are no longer going to take refugees from any country, except for Afrikaners supposedly fleeing persecution in South Africa. So the good news to all the Afrikaners who want to become refugees in the US is you're now the only US refugees eligible underneath the Trump administration. So Trump uses this as a way to sell the domestic narrative in the US that white South Africans are victims in South Africa. Apparently Somalis, Afghanistanis, and others are garbage and should be sent back. I mean, this is the Trump administration's rhetoric. So South Africa is being used in two ways. First, as a negative example, as a warning what socialist, racist, corrupt policies lead to in a country, and secondly, as an example of victimhood in the American cultural wars. Now, this is kind of revolutionary in a way because historically, whites couldn't be victims of discrimination. According to the Trump administration, well, yes, they can. So the logical question is, does the ANC and its allies, such as the DA, actually deserve all the criticism? And the answer to that is, well, pretty much obviously. But the point is that global powers are not saving South Africa. They're using South Africa. South Africa's own failures, its violence, its racial tensions are now all becoming ammo in their own political battles. And our governments are giving them the raw material to turn their own issues into propaganda that can be used against us and their own domestic agendas. We're seeing this right across China. We're seeing it in America. We're seeing it everywhere. And the South African government are too incompetent to deal with it adequately. But in any case, that's the news of today. And I must say that if we get to the next election and people still vote for the ANC, then what this will really show is that retardation in this country is at completely off the charts levels. At least that's my opinion. Do let me know what you think in the comment section below. And until next time, bye.